Arno, welcome back to this panel on green trade. It gives me great pleasure to open this session. Just over a year ago, Her Excellency Laura Clark, British High Commissioner to New Zealand and Governor of the Pitcairn Islands, delivered the keynote address at the Climate and Business Conference on the hope and opportunities of COP26. She reminded us that there was real potential for COVID-19 to distract us from tackling climate change. But the High Commissioner also noted that the global response to the pandemic crisis showed just how fast we could change our policies and our behaviours. And as such, it presented possibilities for a greater ambition to realise reduction in emissions, to build resilience, and to cooperate and support each other in a green recovery. These were the ambitions that underpinned the UK's presidency and co-hosting of COP26 in Glasgow last month. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome High Commissioner Clark to share with us her insights on COP26 and what might result. Over to you.
Well, kia ora koutou. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and a huge mihi to MFAT and the new University of Auckland for hosting this really interesting event and for inviting me to speak. I've actually just been back in the UK, my first trip home since COVID, and I'm now in MIQ catching up with life. So I'm really glad to be joining you and really giving a little bit of the view from the UK as COP26 presidency. And of course, our economies and trade are ultimately dependent on the health of our environment. If we don't have a healthy environment, our economies won't function properly, we won't be able to trade. There is such a dependence there. But ultimately, of course, our environment is under massive threat and on very many measures in a critical condition. And climate change is really one of the most existential of the threats facing our world and the well-being of our world. So COP26, as I've said quite a lot of times before, really was seen as the last best chance to rally action to avert the worst impacts of climate change and keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. And we hosted COP26 in Glasgow in partnership with Italy. And as the host, we set ourselves some very clear goals. We wanted to finalise the Paris Agreement rulebook, and we wanted to make progress on 4 big objectives: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration. And if I can, I'd like to go through those things and really sort of give a sense of what was achieved in those 2 weeks in Glasgow. And I think the first thing to say is these things are extraordinarily challenging. Working by consensus, as we all know, is a really tough thing to do. But despite that challenge of bringing the world together, and despite the challenge of hosting this massive conference in the midst of a global pandemic, I really think we did achieve a lot collectively. So first of all, we did successfully finalise the Paris Agreement rulebook, so really setting the stage for full implementation. That included the difficult issues of common timeframes for nationally determined contributions, the transparency framework for assessing progress, and critically importantly, Article 6 negotiations on carbon markets, which will enable that proper functioning of the trade in carbon credits. So that was really important. We finalised the Paris Agreement, and so that there can be no barrier to full implementation of the Paris Agreement. We also made genuine progress against the 4 goals that I've just set out. So on mitigation, of course, the key goal, the absolutely key goal, was keeping alive that ambition to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we did keep it alive through enhanced mitigation ambition at COP26. So 140 countries came to COP26 with increased 2030 ambition with new NDCs. And it's really worth sort of pausing and reflecting that when the UK took on the COP presidency, or when we became COP presidency designate, 30% of the world's economy was covered by net zero commitments. And right now, 90% of the world's economy is covered by net zero commitments. That includes India, China, and 18 of 20 G20 countries. So that really is significant progress. And over 100 countries responsible for over half of all methane emissions joined the Global Methane Pledge to cut methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And that alone could avoid 0.3 degrees of warming due to the powerful warming effect of methane. So implementation of those NDCs would put us on track currently for 2.4 degrees of warming. Or if all those commitments, including long-term net zero targets, are met, we would be on track for 1.8 degrees of warming. But of course, that if in terms of implementation is a big if. But it is significant progress in terms of ambition, in terms of commitment from just a couple of years ago. But it's still not enough. So at Glasgow, all countries agreed to update their NDCs again in 2022 to get closer to that 1.5 degrees. And then there will also be yearly ministerial meetings to evaluate progress. And I think it's worth noting, right at the end, we all saw the footage. There was a big focus on how the text was watered down at the last minute to talk about phase down rather than phase out coal. And I think the significant thing, though, despite that focus, was that for the first time in a COP decision, there was a special mention to phasing down coal and fossil fuel subsidies. They had not been mentioned before. So that's mitigation. On adaptation, there was a really big focus on adaptation at COP26, record amounts of new commitments of finance for adaptation, and a work plan launched towards a global goal on adaptation. And COP26 also operationalized the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to provide technical support to countries facing irreversible losses from climate change. And that's, of course, a critical consideration for our neighbors here in the South Pacific. On finance, progress both on finance assistance and also green finance. So there was important progress towards meeting our goal of $100 billion per year in climate finance. And that's now on track to be met before 2023 and to be surpassed in total for 2020 to 2025. That was a really big push and really critical, I think, for the legitimacy of the overall COP effort, that assistance for developing countries was provided. In addition, 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions will stop international support for unabated fossil fuel energy sector next year. And there was a real acceleration in the shift to green finance. So 450 financial services firms in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero now has over 130 trillion of financial assets. So that equates to 40% of global financial assets, all committed to aligning with net zero emissions by 2050. On collaboration, the next main goal, we all know that effective climate action requires an all of economy, all of society approach. And COP26, I think, renewed global collaboration and commitment to addressing climate change, with huge numbers of businesses, NGOs, indigenous peoples, and other civil society representatives taking part in the summit in Glasgow. And the UN Race to Zero campaign, which we've been promoting a lot here in New Zealand, has now rallied over 8,000 non-state actors to commit to halving emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. That includes cities, businesses, financial institutions, educational institutions. And together, the members of the Net Zero campaign account to 25% of global CO2 and 50% of global GDP. So there's that sense of momentum across the board. And COP26 also drove important renewed geopolitical collaboration, most importantly through the joint US-China Summit Declaration on Climate Action. New Zealand played a really important part in all of this. We very much welcomed the increased NDC and climate finance commitments. New Zealand also played a really critical role in ensuring that Pacific Island countries and their priorities could be heard at COP26, and also played a really important role in successfully co-facilitating negotiations on the transparency framework. And it was Great to see also, of course, New Zealand's continued leadership on green trade and climate-related financial risk disclosures at COP26 in the side events. So that's my whistle-stop tour of COP26, rather a lot of figures, but I want to just touch briefly on what next, because of course the proof of the pudding is in delivery of those commitments. So the UK is committed to delivering on those commitments throughout our COP presidency, working hard to ensure that the Climate Pact is implemented. And we'll be working to support Egypt as the incoming hosts of COP27. I do think sometimes it can feel a bit gloomy, sometimes it feels like there's too much to do, but there is a real sense of rewiring the global economy to align it to reaching net zero emissions. So I've said that 90% of the world's economy is now covered, and I think by net zero commitments, and governments, businesses, investors and individuals are increasingly alive to thinking about how we value things and factoring the environment into every decision. So I think that trade, of course, the focus of this session is a really important part in our efforts to transition to a green economy. And so a couple of things here. So our free trade agreement with New Zealand, where we recently agreed agreement in principle, sets out very clearly our shared commitment to delivering on the Paris Agreement and a shared commitment to support the trade in environmental goods. New Zealand has been leading the way with the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, and we were pleased to see the expansion of the APEC environmental goods list expanded during New Zealand's hosting year. And I think that shows a clear direction of travel in the region. So a huge mihi to New Zealand for their leadership and hard work in putting these issues front and centre. Now, we were, of course, sad that MC12 couldn't go ahead, but there's a lot that can be done at the WTO, including on fossil fuel subsidy reform and the structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. So we very much welcome New Zealand's thought leadership on environment and trade, and we look forward to hearing more about the coming discussions. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Ngā mihi nui, thank you, Your Excellency, for those insights. We very much appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. So if we were together, we would clap, but obviously we can't do that. And I know that you are unable to stay with us for the rest of the panel and for the discussion. So haere rā, and we will see you again soon. It's my job now to hand over to Professor Stephen Polheke, who will be chairing our panel discussion on green trade policy after COP26 and what that means for recovery. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and thank you very much, Laura Clark, and also Jennifer Curtin for the introduction. So very warm welcome to everyone in this session. I see there are many of you, so that's really great to see. So the format of this session is that I will quickly introduce our three speakers, who will then each take turns in presenting on the topic of green trade policy. But I very much encourage every one of you to submit your questions in the live Q&A section of the website. And then after our three speakers have each spoken, we will open the floor to those questions and open up for broader discussion. So just very quickly, our three speakers today are Kate Wilson Butler. She's head of climate action for the Sustainable Business Council. So, welcome. And also Caroline Lambert, who is the head of trade for the delegation of the European Union to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And our third speaker today is Helen Churchman, who is the principal advisor at the Ministry for Primary Industries here in New Zealand. So very warm welcome to all of you. And yeah, so I suggest I stick to the order that's in the program, which means that I'll first give the floor to Kate. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Polheke. And tēnā koutou katoa, ko Kate Wilson-Butler tōku ingoa. I'm, as the Professor has mentioned, Head of Climate Action at the Sustainable Business Council, and it's a real pleasure to be taking part in this panel discussion today. Thanks so much to Auckland University and to MFAT for organising the event and having me along. Having spent some formative years at MFAT, first working in the Trade and Economic Group and latterly on climate change, this is a topic dear to my heart. I thought I might focus my comments at the beginning of the panel on what happened at and around COP on trade and what this means for where green trade policy might head next. That will all be, of course, through the lens of what we focus on here at SBC, being chiefly climate action and therefore climate policy. So first, what happened at COP, and in particular what happened at COP on trade? So we've heard from the UK Commissioner, Laura Clark, just now about the key COP takeaways from the perspective of the host country. And in the business-led discussions I've had on COP since its conclusion a few weeks ago, I've heard the outcome described as better than feared, but worse than hoped. There are a range of views on what came out of this COP, from glass half full to glass half empty. Personally, I take the glass half full approach. What we saw from COP represented solid but incremental progress, as one would expect from a multilateral conference involving tragedies of commons, of horizons, and ultimately 193 countries trying to agree on something. What I think was really exciting about this COP from a business perspective was that it felt like a paradigm shift, with the role of the private sector coming to the fore more than ever. I think Laura Clark just described this as a rewiring of the global economy, which I would endorse. And this is evident, for example, in the $130 trillion of investment that is now aligned with net zero under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, led by Mark Carney. And many of the key outcomes from COP that are of key interest and to at least some of our members in the business community we're engaged with sit at the nexus where climate or sustainability and trade meet. So I thought I might take a minute to outline what the key trade-related developments were from COP. And a few developments stood out in my mind when I was reflecting on this, two of which actually relate to EU announcements. So I'll keep that comment on those very brief so I don't steal Caroline's thunder. Number one, the US and EU announced an agreement to cooperate on greener production standards for steel and aluminium. And this announcement, at least what was publicly announced, was quite light on detail, but it is really interesting because it represents, I think, potential first steps towards a possible climate club type approach, which has been talked about at the WTO. Number two, also from the EU, whilst not strictly at COP, but hot on the heels of the COP announcement around deforestation, the EU outlined a draft law requiring companies to prove that certain food and wood imports are not linked to deforestation. I'm sure Caroline will talk about that in more detail, but it's a novel move and the business community has certainly taken note. The third, and I think, again, Laura Clark touched on this before, the US-China cooperation deal. Although this didn't directly address trade, it does bear mentioning because we have two of the largest emitters and technology producers agreeing to work together on the low carbon transition, which is a huge development with potential ripple effects, including out to trade. And the last, but most certainly not the least development that I would mention was the Ministerial statement on the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or thankfully ACTS for short. And I think Helen will touch on this New Zealand-led open plurilateral initiative in more detail, but you can't really mention COP developments on trade and climate without mentioning the ACTS. To my mind, this represents New Zealand at its best internationally, innovating and collaborating to explore the art of the possible and blaze new trails with like-minded countries. The ACTS has potential to be a real groundbreaking platform for true integration of climate and trade policy, so it's really exciting to see the progress being made here, particularly the traction being achieved on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So then what comes next? What are some of these new directions that we're to think about in the context of this panel? I've heard COP26 described as being an inflection point, creating this incredible spotlight on climate action and impetus for change. As Her Excellency mentioned before, for the first time we see a window, albeit tiny and fast closing, to reach through and grab a 1.5 degree world. So the question across the board now, including for trade, is how to harness that momentum for real concrete climate action. That action, we've heard discussed in multiple forums since the closure of the COP, needs to be urgent and ambition ramped up if the world is to bend the emissions curve in the short amount of time that we have left. The architecture of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, including the Paris Agreement, will always remain the central tool for the global response on climate. But I think that governments and stakeholders, particularly the private sector, need to start to think a bit more laterally and come up with some innovative solutions to secure those commitments and progress towards them, to bend that curve. So I'd suggest then in this context that the time is right for a deeper dialogue between government and business to broaden our notions of how trade and climate and broader sustainability outcomes can be mutually supportive. And there are a range of questions that could be addressed in this context, including whether we can think about developing New Zealand into a test bed for zero carbon manufacturing, rather than simply accepting that heavy emitting industries will leave New Zealand as our economy decarbonizes. So just to touch on that in a bit more detail, if you look at the modelling done, for example, by the Climate Change Commission, it assumes that significant manufacturers will leave New Zealand, freeing up zero carbon energy available to support New Zealand's transition, which is great for our domestic transition, but of course, climate change is a global problem, and that risks leaking that carbon to another economy. And the question is, can we look at how our regulatory environment and innovation ecosystem can attract investment in a green manufacturing sector for New Zealand, and providing us, of course, then with not just FDI, but a trade advantage potentially as well. And I know that MB is already doing some work in this area with industry, which is very promising. And the final question I would raise is, with the conclusion of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the opening up of deeper cooperation between countries to accelerate emissions reductions globally through the use of carbon markets, can we learn from the experience in negotiating and implementing regional and plurilateral trade agreements to bring some of that rigor and environmental credibility to these arrangements? So in this space, Motu has done a really interesting piece of work on how small groups of countries can come together to implement cooperation under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement with environmental integrity. They call the concept climate action teams. And there's a question in my mind about whether some of our emerging trade and climate platforms, for example, like the ACTs, could provide a future forum for this type of cooperation where you really see this worlds of climate and trade policy start to intersect in a meaningful way. So those are just a couple of ideas, and I'll leave it there because I want to create space for Caroline and Helen as well. But there are a range of ways in which we could make climate and trade more closely aligned in the future as the zero carbon transition accelerates. And I think a closer dialogue between the private sector and government on this would be a really welcome development. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. So then I'll just move straight to our next speaker, Caroline.
Many thanks, Stephen. Many thanks, Kate. Tēnā koutou katoa, kia ora, everyone. I'll start by explaining what's so fantastic about the Glasgow's Climate COP results for the European Union. For us, one of the main success is the recognition, black and white, in the Glasgow's Climate Pact that humanity's terms of engagement with the planet are non-negotiable. In fact, we all sign up to 2 ultimatums that are in the text. The first is related to time. We have 8 years left to keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, the only safe operating space on the planet that avoids utter chaos. The second ultimatum is linked to the effort, the emissions reduction effort that we need to mobilize in the next 8 years. That corresponds to around 7% less emissions each year. When last year, at the 8th of paralytic 2020, during the pandemic, our emissions only reduced 6%. So pause a minute and imagine what a business as usual recovery would mean. We stand at an incredibly momentous time in history. It's the worst of time, it's the best of time, depends how you want to see it. But we in the European Union believe that in this climate emergency, a green trade policy is a policy that increases our collective capacity to confront the existential challenges that we are facing. And there are 3 ways in which trade can help. The first is to free the trade of what's green, green goods, green services, and flows of green capital, because we need to make unprecedented investments in the years ahead. About 459 times what it took to put man on the moon. We made that calculation in the European Union. The second is to free national ambition, to galvanize countries to take ambition action and free them from the doubts coming from level playing field concerns or from being held hostage to the tragedy of the commons deadlock. The third is to take responsibility for the impact of our consumption abroad. So I'll start with the first, free what's green. Of course, the best would be to do it at multilateral level. The fact is that at 26 years of age, same age as COPs, at 26 years of age, WTO is not really functioning anymore. This being said, both New Zealand and the European Union are not giving up and really pushing together for a broad pledge and a clear pledge to mainstream climate and environmental concerns in the way WTO reform will be handled. Also at COP, our Trade Commissioner, Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, announced that he will create and lead a coalition, a climate coalition of trade ministers with the first meeting next year. We're also, of course, doing things at plurilateral level, and I have to really congratulate New Zealand on everything that's done through ACCTS in particular, but also all the leadership on the plurilateral statements at WTO on fossil fuel subsidy reforms, for example. In the European Union, in the world, that's still in transit with regard to multilateralism, we also have a knack for autonomous action, unilateral action. What we've done recently, for example, is to green our aid for trade. But also last week, we announced our Global Gateway Initiative. This is an initiative to free flows of capital, green capital, to help the world with the building of the green infrastructure that's needed to meet COP26's goals. We will mobilize $500 billion New Zealand dollars in the next 5 years for infrastructure projects that will be human-centered, value-based, based on a do no harm oath for the environment, and help us bring us closer to our goals without creating debt anxiety and creating links and connectivity without creating dependencies. And of course, we're also using our bilateral tools to free the trade of what's green. The European Union has the largest web of FTAs worldwide with the largest number of countries, 46 FTAs with 78 countries in total. And so our bilateral settings are important. We have what is called a trade and sustainable development chapter, which we have used so far, for example, for things like green public procurement provisions, but it's not enough. So we're currently doing a review of our trade and climate policy settings. We have done a public consultation. We have commissioned a study that the London School of Economics is leading, an international study on best practices worldwide with regard to climate parameters in FTAs. We'll have the results very soon, and we hope to negotiate that upgraded version of our trade and climate parameters with New Zealand next year. That would be the first country with whom we would try to negotiate an upgraded version. The second objective is to free national ambition. And you've all heard that. Yes, climate action is important, but we only represent X% of emissions. Or yes, we need to take action, but what about China? And what about India? And what about the US? The whataboutism concern, which is a call for delay in the end. And to fight that call for delay, we can use our bilateral agreements as well. In the European Union agreement with the UK, for example, we have that provision that says that both parties will effectively implement Paris agreements. And that is an essential clause of our deal, meaning that if one of the parties doesn't implement effectively the Paris agreement, then trade preferences are suspended. We're also looking at better enforcement measures and also the inclusion of civil society and monitoring of these agreements. But we recently also proposed a new autonomous measure. This is very important for us because we're uniquely ambitious internationally with regard to domestic climate action. Others have plans, great plans, but we are a bit beyond plans at the moment. We've tabled legislation, and that puts us in a position that we know well, which is the first mover on climate action. We've already reduced our emissions by 30%. And it means that we have to take into account level playing field concerns. And that is the background for CBAM that I can answer questions about if you're interested. And the background is that we have to protect our contribution to the climate and avoid leakage, but we also have to ensure that we keep people on board for the transition that has been called domestically a social and economic experiment, because it's as yet unparalleled, but I'm hopeful that other countries will also table similar legislation soon. Then the third action, which is taking responsibility for our consumption. The European Union these days, only 8% of the world's emissions, right? But we can punch above these emissions weight because we have a market of 450 million people, relatively wealthy, that is attractive. And we also have some norm setting and standard setting power internationally on those issues. So that's why we've tabled 2 weeks ago these deforestation-free supply chain proposal that Kate mentioned, which covers 6 commodities: wood, cattle, palm oil, soybeans, coffee, and cocoa. Because Europeans, unbeknownst of them, are responsible for 16% of the world's deforestation since 1990, only European consumers. So we can have an impact if we have, if we boost deforestation out of our supply chain. So that's quite a new ambitious proposal, and that will apply to our supply chains, whether or not deforestation was legal on a third country of origin. So in conclusion, I would say that the European Union is using trade, reshaping its trade engagement to enable ambition at home and abroad. Our aim is to play for Team World in doing that. It's not to close borders, it's to keep them open and open them further for sustainable outcomes, and to be assertive so that we pull others along. We think that it's through the weaving of the fabric of shared interests that we will also create the conditions for solidarity. And we will need Maritahi more than ever in the years ahead, because we have 8 years left. It's a challenge that only the team of 8 billion can really pull off. And we have to do that together. And we need New Zealand's team of 5 million and your pragmatic, principled and kind approach to trade and to policy making in general. You need the Tika, Pono and Aroha based transition. Yes, well done, New Zealand, and really happy to be working here for New Zealand, for the European Union. And I think that together we can really make a change, a step change for green trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. So let's move to our third speaker, Helen Churchman, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Professor Poolheke and ATEPS for inviting me to speak on this really fascinating and important topic today. Thanks also to Her Excellency High Commissioner Clark and my fellow panelists, Kate and Caroline, for their interesting insights that they've offered. Given the significance of agriculture, both to New Zealand's economy and to our emissions profile, I think it's really important to offer an agricultural perspective as part of this panel. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, I've got one key message today, and I want to make it right at the start. So if there's only one thing that each of you take away from today's session, I want it to be that environmentally harmful subsidies are bad and need to be eliminated. Now, given the topic, I do want to link back to COP26 at the outset and say and agree with each of the other speakers that COP really shines a spotlight on climate change, which is extremely important, and it has done that again this year. But most of the policies that I'm going to be discussing actually do predate COP26. And that's because policy development in this area actually began well over a decade ago. I think that the COP26 presidency's focus on environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies has given this issue more profile, and that's really great. But rather than a raft of new directions as a result of COP26, I suggest that it's an acceleration and an increase in importance that's being placed on existing trends. Before going any further, I do also want to echo some of the comments made at this morning's panel on Te Tiriti and Indigenous trade policy. And that's that in any area of trade policy development, we need to explore, value, and protect the leadership and knowledge of Indigenous people. And this is something I want you to keep in mind as I continue talking through the rest of my presentation. So the first thing I want to do this morning is outline what agricultural trade policy can offer to help limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. What we're really talking about here is the levers that governments have to either facilitate or effectively obstruct or even prevent trade from taking place. In the agricultural space, the main types of policies we're talking about are tariffs that apply at the border, subsidies for domestic production, import or export restrictions or bans, and technical requirements that relate to things like health and safety or labeling, for example. Now, each of these levers can either be used as a force for good in support of climate action or in the opposite way. And I'm going to suggest that they should be used as a force for good. So what is New Zealand doing in this space then? Well, I want to start by saying what we are not doing. I want to be clear that it is not the New Zealand government position that agricultural production in this country or any other country should stop. Yes, we are a country facing a number of environmental challenges, some of which are related to agricultural production, but we're also developing domestic policies where our agriculture sectors are playing a major role actually in addressing these issues in areas such as biodiversity, water quality, and climate change. When it comes to trade, we see New Zealand's role as being critical to the supporting global food security. Factors such as a growing world population and significant poverty and malnutrition mean that despite environmental challenges associated with agricultural production, the majority of the world's population is actually more concerned about ensuring adequate food supply and affordability. New Zealand is really well placed to support global food security, whilst also having the lowest possible environmental impact given our low carbon footprint production systems. As Prime Minister Ardern recently said in her address at the United Nations Food Systems Summit in September, the answers to our food security and environmental challenges do not lie in isolationism. They lie in growing food where the environment supports it best and emissions efficiency is greatest, whilst minimizing the barriers to trade. So against this backdrop, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes outlining New Zealand's current green agricultural trade policy priorities. First and foremost, as already highlighted, this is addressing environmentally harmful subsidies. This is an area where we see environmental harm currently occurring actually as a result of countries' agricultural trade policies today. While subsidies can be a useful tool to incentivize behavior change, some agricultural subsidies are encouraging food to be grown in environments that it's not well suited to, or which require significant natural resource input where it's not abundant, for example, water or specific soil nutrients. Subsidies directly targeted at making inputs like fertilizer cheaper, for example, have a really clear environmental impact as well, because it leads to overuse. To give you a bit more context about agricultural support, between $500 and $700 billion per year is spent by governments supporting their agriculture sectors. And this is at a time when developed countries have struggled and only just managed to find the $100 billion they pledged to help developing countries with their transition to a lower carbon future, as mentioned by Her Excellency earlier. So the New Zealand government is actively championing for these volumes of subsidies to come down. And we're doing that through the WTO, UN institutions like the UNFCCC, the UN Food Systems Summit, the UN Environment Programme, the OECD, APEC, and in FTAs, where New Zealand is pushing to include disciplines on all forms of environmentally harmful subsidies in our future FTA agenda, as I think Claire Kelly mentioned yesterday. New Zealand's also taking a similar approach to addressing environmentally harmful fisheries and fossil fuel subsidies, with efforts underway in similar international institutions and also as part of our FTA agenda. Now, there are 5 other priorities that I do want to touch on really briefly in this area that do go slightly wider than agriculture. These are, first, ensuring that trade and sustainability chapters of FTAs are enforceable, so subject to dispute settlement. Second, incorporating parts of the Paris Agreement into FTAs, which is something that Her Excellency also mentioned, which is featuring in the New Zealand-UK Agreement in Principle and the final outcome as well when this is reached. Third, contributing to the development of a common international approach to eco-labelling. Fourth, and this was also touched on by Kate and others, achieving trade liberalisation for environmental goods and services, which is a key part of the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability. And finally, pricing agricultural emissions. While this is more of a domestic policy, I did want to mention that the New Zealand government is working in partnership with the agriculture sector and Māori to develop a farm-level emissions pricing system that will measure, price, and reduce agricultural greenhouse gases from 2025. Finally, there's another global trend that we're aware of, but are approaching cautiously, and is something Caroline touched on, and that's conditionality, which is making tariff reductions conditional on things like meeting animal welfare standards or sustainability criteria. One example of this is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and I am happy to explain New Zealand's position on this in the Q&A if people are interested. But finally, to wrap up, the point that I really want to make is that green trade policies are not going to resolve climate change on their own, but I think they are a really important and relevant piece of the puzzle, especially the elimination of environmentally harmful subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. So I thought this was a fascinating session because all three of you bring a very diverse perspective to a very common problem that we in the end have to solve together. But you know, it's very clear that it's not easy and not simple. So I'm looking at the Q&A, and there's one question that came through. So by Alison Wood. So maybe I should ask Alison Wood to unmute and ask the question directly.
Kia ora. My question is for anyone on the panel. It is linked to the COPs and also looking at the 2021 EU Commission's trade policy review that indicates to facilitate and enforce green and sustainable supply chain that they would need to change the WTO's what we call the generalized system of preference, which gives zero duty for developing nations to include modern labour and slavery transparency. And it also talked about an autonomous measure with carbon border adjustment mechanisms at the EU border. Now, this would have a direct impact in New Zealand and developing nations, particularly because we have very long supply chains. My question is that Laura indicated that funding is for developing nations. So from a practical aspect, how will New Zealand and smaller developed nations be supported in adjusting to what seems to be as a non-trade barrier due to increasing compliance, regulatory and carbon footprint costs for New Zealand exporters?
I'm not sure which of the three of you would like to answer this question. It's really about yeah, Caroline, please go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much, Alison, for your question. So I'll focus on CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is focused on 6 industrial products: aluminum, steel, fertilizer, cement, power. I've gotten one. No, 5, these 5 ones. And we've did a careful assessment of the impact on small and developing nations, and an assessment as to whom would be covered the most by this new measure. And I can reassure you that the main nations that will feel an impact are Russia, China, South Korea, Turkey. So that avoids the nations that you have in mind. And the measure is non-discriminatory in the sense that it doesn't target a particular country, and it recognizes the actual incorporated carbon into the imported product. So there is full possibility for any importer to, and it is particularly the case in some emerging economy, to send some of the products from the cleanest of their companies that would actually probably be even cleaner than some of our own industrial goods. So it relates to exactly what the situation is. in other countries with regard to the cleaning of the industrial systems. And it's not a given that you would find necessarily a big difference between what's in the EU and what's outside the European Union at the moment, because like New Zealand and other big countries, so far we've been protecting our industry from the impacts of the climate costs. So they will only start paying and then therefore start investing in the next years. I'll stop here.
So I'd like to, oh, Helen, would you like to respond as well?
Yes, I'm happy to just give a couple of quick points in terms of outlining the New Zealand approach to CBAMs and other types of conditionality. Just to say that also in the development of these new tools, it's really important that that's done based on transparent criteria, scientifically justified, WTO consistent, non-discriminatory, and in a way that is not a disguised impediment to trade. So those are the areas that we're really focusing on when we're looking at any development of new types of conditionality like this. Thanks.
All right, so I'd like to mix in a quick question to Kate as well. So the green trade policies that are proposed, and one of them is the CBAM, effectively require firms to prove to some extent, to what extent the exports they are sending to the European Union are green or not green. How much carbon or other greenhouse gases were emitted in the production of these goods. So that might require quite a bit of administrative work to prove these things and to account for all these things, especially indeed when supply chains are long, like came up in one of the questions. So to what extent are New Zealand businesses ready for this? If this, if time is short and this will be implemented quite soon.
That's a great question, and thank you for passing it my way. I suppose, well, we have the privilege of representing members who are already well advanced on the sustainability journey, as the name suggests. The Sustainable Business Council attracts members who are quite advanced in this space. But what we see amongst our membership, at least, is that companies are already pretty well advanced on the journey of measuring and managing their emissions. And I suppose entering that new frontier, and some of them are already quite advanced in this space too, of what we call Scope 3 emissions. So looking into the supply chain and starting to quantify those and enter into discussions to bring those down. So the data is there, and the question is, how does that represented in a context of a regulatory measure like a carbon border adjustment measure? And I would echo Helen's comments around some of the attributes that these sorts of measures need to have to ensure that they're not an impediment to trade, because many of our companies would have that underlying data and be able to prove what's asked already. But the question is how. The devil is always in the detail with these kinds of measures, and the question is, how does that work in practice, and how does that turn up in terms of actual trade flows? Yeah, I'll probably leave it there in the interest of time.
All right, thank you. So there's one more question that came in from Mira B, which is about the impact of these policies for negotiations. On one hand, there's the EU's Green Deal. On the other hand, there's New Zealand's own climate priorities, and how might this affect the FTA between the two regions. And related to this question for Caroline is, given the regulatory burden of changing every FTA, of which there are so many, in principle, it would not be necessary if the trade partner in question would also price carbon and other emissions to the same extent that the EU does this. So is there also thoughts about making it more explicit that all of this can be prevented if, say, New Zealand would also have an ETS that prices carbon to the same levels as currently carbon is priced in the European Union?
Well, just to say, we are not discussing CBAM in the context of the FTA, because of course CBAM is an autonomous measure. So as concerns our discussions with New Zealand on the climate-related aspects of the FTA, I think we're really well aligned. But of course, because we're currently undergoing our own review as to what we want to see as parameters in the FTA, we're not really in a position to exactly explain right now what our position will be in terms of what we want to see. We still have to have the results of the public consultation of the report that we've commissioned. So I have to be really honest here and say that probably New Zealand is a bit in the dark as to what we want to put in there. We have not come to a conclusion yet. as regard CBAM, well, the products that are covered by CBAM are not products that, to my knowledge, New Zealand is sending to the European Union. And so it's not a measure that we are discussing bilaterally, although of course we've heard the criteria that New Zealand thinks are useful to assess the WTO compatibility of our measure, and totally agree with them, and we believe our measure meets these criteria. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helen, Caroline, and Kate, and also our audience for submitting the questions. I thought it was a really good and interesting, fascinating session. Again, the different perspectives on this matter. So I just want to remind everyone that you can connect up with the panel in the meeting hub within the platform that this conference is held through. So we can continue the conversation there as well. However, we do have to end here because very soon we'll start the next session, 2.4, on New Zealand's APEC hosting year and closing remarks as well. So thank you very much, everyone.